For our last lecture video in this series, I'm going to introduce you to invertebrate breathing systems, and I'm going to group together both the aquatic invertebrates and the trachea invertebrates into a single video. For these breathing systems, you're not going to need to know as much specifically about breathing cycles or particular anatomical details. Instead, though, I do want you to have a general sense of the major type of breathing organ that's used, some major features of those organs, and anything distinct, unique, or interesting about those specific breathing organs. And you'll see plenty of that very soon. So for the marine invertebrates, we're going to kind of consider two main groups, mollusks and crustaceans, with a focus on the Decopod Crustaceans. Before I dive into either of those, just a quick comment that for small aquatic invertebrates, they can just exchange gases across their body surfaces. They don't really need any specialized organs, right? If your tissues are thin enough, simple diffusion will do the job. So things like flatworms and jellyfish do not have very fancy breathing organs. In contrast, larger marine animals basically have a wide array of structures that we collectively refer to as gills. For the mollusks, mollusks are really distinguished by having a mantle cavity, a cavity that protects their organs, and collectively they have gills that are suspended in that mantle cavity. The structure and organization of those gills vary, and how water is moved across the gills also varies. So I've just got a couple of examples here. So I've got this marine snail here on the lower left. So as this illustrates, the gills in the marine snail will hang from the snail's mantle cavity, and water will flow through the mantle cavity in such a way that these gills can acquire oxygen and release carbon dioxide using countercurrent exchange. I've also got a clam up here as an example bivalve, and clams and other bivalves have gills that are kind of sheet-like in structure, and the gills are used both for gas exchange and also as a filter feeding apparatus. So if you're going to be passing a lot of water through, might as well make the most out of that and use it both for food and also for gas exchange. Here's also gills in a cephalopod, like a squid. So for the cephalopods, water is flowed across the gills basically by the squeezing of the body cavity. So now let's take a quick look at the Decopod crustaceans. So in the Decopod crustaceans, they have a hard outer carapace, and that carapace actually hangs over the gills. So here we're looking at a frontal view, so as if we took this lobster and just chopped it along the front to take a look at its internal anatomy. And you can see on the outside we've got the lobster's carapace providing some protection on the exterior of the lobster, and lobsters then have gills that are protected inside of this carapace, but they're distinct from the remainder of the internal organs. And so these gills can float around in these cavities, and then lobsters will move water across the gills using a specialized organ that's located nearby. So this organ just kind of flails around, and that facilitates the flow of water across these gills. So not particularly sophisticated, but it gets the job done. And if we also look at land-dwelling crustaceans, the land-dwelling species also retain gills, but the exact shape of the gills in the land crustaceans can vary a little bit. So in that context, there needs to be some additional structure so the gills don't collapse when exposed to air. And other than that, the general concept still holds for gas exchange. So that's the aquatic invertebrates, very briefly. So we're going to spend a little more time now talking about the tracheid invertebrates. So these are land-dwelling invertebrates. So tracheid invertebrates are really interesting because in the tracheid invertebrates, their gas exchange system is decoupled from their circulatory system. This has a lot of implications, and I hope you can appreciate that it's pretty weird and different relative to everything else we've seen. So these guys do not follow the full pattern of, bulk flow or convection, diffusion, convection, diffusion. Instead, they simply get gases to tissues through the tracheal system. So it's a one-step process instead. And so the major structures that do the oxygen delivery are referred to as the trachea, or tracheae, as you see here, plural. And then these are connected to the outside world through some small openings called spiracles. These guys are not limited to having, a single breathing hole in the way that we are. They have spiracles that can be positioned all over their bodies. So, when they take a breath, that can be opening a lot of different structures simultaneously. Historically, we kind of thought these were boring, and that they just use simple diffusion to move gases. And if that were the case, insects vary in how active they are, so there's some variation in oxygen demand that they'll experience. So, the thinking was, well, what do they need to do if they need more oxygen? Well, basically, as an insect is using oxygen, that's essentially going to amplify the oxygen partial pressure gradient between the external environment and the mitochondria, right? So if we change our delta C, or our difference in partial pressure, right, that can also speed up diffusion rate. So again, a fairly direct mechanism for obtaining more oxygen when there's more oxygen demand. Okay. There's some other interesting quirks in insect evolution to think about a little bit. If we go back in the fossil record to the Paleozoic era, so that was about 245 to 570 million years ago, in the fossil record we can find evidence of giant fossil insects. I mentioned this because I've tried to emphasize that diffusion rates in liquids are very slow, right? So in general, if animals are just relying on simple diffusion to get oxygen to tissues, it seems very unrealistic for that to be possible in an insect with a really large body size. How can something with a 3-foot wingspan just be using simple diffusion to obtain oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide? So one component of our explanation for how these giant fossil insects existed is if we look back at the atmospheric composition during the Paleozoic era, there was actually a higher concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere during that time period, relative to contemporary times. So it's possible that part of the reason that these giant insects were able to evolve is because they're in an environment with much higher atmospheric oxygen. So they may not have needed as good of a gas exchange system to get enough oxygen to function. And if this is a topic that's interesting to you, I've also got a link to a longer explainer about the prehistoric insects here. So that's sort of our historic view. But more recently, a number of scientists have been gathering evidence that insects are not so passive in their gas exchange after all. It turns out there are a number of multiple processes that insects use to regulate gas exchange. So to give you one example, initially we thought trachea were just kind of these, static tubes. So, sort of like, pipes or plumbing. More recently, we've developed technologies that let us visualize tissues in living insects. Prior to the development of these technologies, they were too small. There wasn't a whole lot we could do. But more recently, so this is a facility run by the Argonne National Labs that provides a synchrotron X-ray. And the synchrotron X-ray, basically the beam gets focused around this circular chamber, and that focused beam allowed us to develop really high contrast, focused imaging of very tiny living insects. So when we did that, people stuck insects into this X-ray beam. They wound up finding that no, trachea are not just static tubes, they do actually change in shape over the course of a breathing cycle. And I think it's kind of powerful to see this as it happens. So here is a short video clip that's going to show us tracheal pumping, and then it's also going to show us carbon dioxide production coinciding with the cycles of tracheal pumping in this insect. So the carbon dioxide spikes and the coincidence of these pumping cycles together provide pretty strong evidence that this is a functional effort to actively engage in gas exchange. Okay, so the trachea in this image are tubes running across the video. Right, so you can see as they squeeze and release, we see spikes in carbon dioxide from the spiracle near these trachea. Okay. So maybe they're not so passive after all. There are also insects that will use some larger scale ventilation strategy. So in insects like grasshoppers, locusts, bumblebees, and ants, if you watch them closely, you can see many of them engaging in abdominal pumping. So I have a video of a digger bee here that is engaging in some abdominal pumping. So that's going to expand and contract the abdomen, and that's again going to squeeze and release the tracheal tubes that run through the abdomen. Okay, so here's our digger bee breathing. All right, very nice. Okay. There's another feature in insects that fly, which is that as they're flying, the action of the muscles that they use to fly functionally can auto-ventilate the muscle. So to understand this, we need to look a little bit more closely at how insect flight muscle is arranged. So again, here we're looking at a frontal section of an insect. So as if we chopped its head off, we're just looking at that insect's thorax, and the blue guys here are the insect wings, and we've got two sections to this insect's thorax, to its exoskeleton, right? So in flying insects, the thorax is fairly rigid, so we can think of this as being a dorsal plate to the thorax, and then a larger ventral surface to the thorax. Inside of the thorax, flying insects have two different groups of muscles. So one group we can see running from the top to the bottom of the thorax, and these are referred to as the dorsoventral flight muscles because they connect the dorsal and ventral surfaces. And then there's another set that's running on basically straight out of the screen as we're seeing this here. Those are referred to as the dorsal longitudinal muscles. And these two groups of muscles work in opposition to each other to either pull the dorsal and ventral surfaces closer together or to allow them to separate out again. And I think it's easier to see a short animation of this. So here's just an animation of the flying motion generated by the dorsoventral flight muscles. So as the muscle's getting fatter, that muscle's contracting. As it gets skinnier, that muscle's relaxing. And you can see that really changes the shape of the insect thorax. And that change in shape is then going to alter the shape of the tracheals that supply oxygen to these muscles. And that's going to facilitate movement of those gases past the muscle. Okay, it's pretty amazing. Okay, so we saw that not all animals breathe continuously so far, right? So we've had some examples of apnea in the amphibians and apnea in reptiles as well. And insects, some insects also engage in some patterns of discontinuous gas exchange. So they don't always keep those spiracles open to allow air to flow in and out. Just to give you an example of this, I've put some carbon dioxide traces up here from an ant queen, where I measured that ant queen's carbon dioxide production. So our x-axis in each of these panels is time, and then y-axis is the amount of carbon dioxide she produced, just measured with a carbon dioxide analyzer. And in this particular queen, on the first measurement date, you can see where I put her into the measurement chamber, and there's some variation in how much carbon dioxide she's releasing, but she's pretty much releasing CO2 continuously. A little bit later on, we start to see larger peaks and troughs in her carbon dioxide production, and you can start to see the appearance of some spots where the carbon dioxide levels she produced were 0. So she's not releasing any carbon dioxide, and then followed by some spikes. And a little bit further on, that queen shifted over to complete discontinuous gas exchange, where in between bursts of carbon dioxide levels drop all the way back down to 0. There are still a lot of outstanding questions about why insects might do this, but a consequence of it is we could expect a buildup of carbon dioxide in the insect's tissues, including in the tracheals, and also an oxygen deficit inside of those tracheals. When we're thinking about this carbon dioxide buildup, we can't just think about that in terms of gas production, right? Because carbon dioxide has a fairly high solubility coefficient. So in this whole process, we think that carbon dioxide buildup happens in the form of bicarbonate in the insect's blood or hemolymph. Okay, so it's in solution. So if oxygen's being used, carbon dioxide's building up in solution, that's going to mean that the total pressure in the tracheals will drop, and therefore when an insect opens up its spiracles again, that's going to favor the movement of air from the outside back into those tracheals. So that's our terrestrial insects. I want to take a very quick look at some aquatic insects. And in aquatic insects, we see a return to gills. So the aquatic insects have tracheal gills. So these are gills associated with this tracheal system, and they're typically formed from parts of the exoskeleton. The exact location of tracheal gills will depend on the species of aquatic insect. So on the right-hand side, I've got a picture of a mayfly larva, and this mayfly larva has tracheal gills that are hanging off of its abdomen to facilitate gas exchange. And then on the left-hand side, I've got a picture of a dragonfly nymph who has gills that are protrusions from its rectum. So dragonfly larvae actually breathe with their butts. Okay, that takes us through our tour of gas exchange structures across a wide range of organisms. I hope you can appreciate just how diverse those structures are. It can be a little bit overwhelming to try and remember how all those different structures work. So sometimes it helps to see things from a slightly different perspective. So I want to show you a website that got started by some scientists, and unfortunately I think they've paused the project indefinitely at this stage. But they have some really fantastic material together to help us think about gas exchange from a slightly different view. So I'm going to take you to that website Noticing. Okay. And they've got a bunch of different things here. So an article on an insect that breathes through its butt. At this point, what I want to bring you to is a page called Gasp, a Breathing Puzzle. Okay. So this has got a narrative. One of the most powerful parts of this site are some really beautiful illustrations of breathing cycles in different types of animals. So we've got an example in a human here. Here's our bird breathing cycle again. And then some interesting things about insect breathing cycles, including some really beautiful pictures of insect spiracles and an example of an insect that is transparent, so you can actually see the tracheals in this insect, which is pretty cool. So that's it for breathing systems, and from here our next topic is going to be dealing with our next component of getting oxygen to the tissues that need it and removing carbon dioxide from those tissues. So we're going to be examining how gas gets transported in blood in much greater detail.